Our next speaker is Antony Kolenc. He's the Associate Professor of Law at the University of North Texas, Dallas, but he's the incoming director of the Veterans and Service Members Law Clinic at Ave Maria School of Law, beginning this August. And he comes to Ave Maria after spending 3 years on the law as a law professor at the University of North Texas Dallas College of Law, and 7 years on the faculty of the Florida Coastal School of Law. Professor Kolenc received his Juris Doctorate degree in 1999, graduating at the top of his class from the University of Florida College of Law. He received his Master of Arts degree in Theology and Christian Ministry from the Franciscan University of Steubenville. His professional writings have focused on matters of constitutional law and military policy, especially focusing on freedom of religion. He and his wife, Elisa, homeschooled their 5 children. Professor Kolenc will be talking about Veritatis Splendor and state accommodation of religious free exercise. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Your Eminence, Your Excellency, it is an honor to be here. I am by no means a scholar of John Paul II, although I was a little boy when he became Pope, and like many of you, he influenced my life growing up. And since I'm not a scholar, I decided to just read you dramatic excerpts from Veritatis Splendor for the next 20, or actually I only have 18 minutes now, thank you.
I'll see the
But no, that was Joan. I tried to do a joke. It didn't work. Joan told me I needed to start with a joke. All right. So what I want to do with this discussion, and maybe I'll just turn this a little bit so I could see it, has already, all the groundwork has been laid. Cardinal Ike laid it this morning. Professor Weiler laid it. And, many times we've talked about conscience and John Paul II's discussion on that, and that is a big part of what's in Veritatis Splendor. And I want to connect that to some of the things I write about, freedom of religion, free exercise clause in the United States Supreme Court. I've written a little bit on the European Court, and I apologize to my Latin American colleagues because I have excluded your Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and that's a glaring oversight on my part. But so what I want to do is really focus very narrowly here today on a few of the conscience issues that are in the forefront today of religious freedom and those 2 courts. And so with that, of course, we've heard a lot about both of these courts, but especially the European Court. These courts have some similarities, right? They are both governing sovereign nations or states. In the United States, they both are supposed to have limited powers and defer, be very deferential to what these states are doing. And so it's sort of a tale of some of the cases that are coming out of those courts, and of course the tale of Pope John Paul II, and specifically focusing on Veritatis Splendor, which builds on Vatican II's Declaration on Religious Freedom, and the Pope had also written another encyclical, Redemptor Hominis, in 1979, which also talked about this issue of religious freedom and conscience. And so I'll start with then 3 principles that we've already heard about. Cardinal Ike laid them out for us so nicely this morning, especially the second one. But this first one, actually, Professor Scarnecchi was talking about yesterday, and that was this idea of the dignity of the human person in obeying God's will through his conscience. And so I'll start with that. I won't read from the excerpts that are up there on the screen. You could read them yourself. But essentially what we've got here is John Paul telling us that our freedom, or perhaps we would call it what'd you call it yesterday? Participated theonomy. Our freedom, our dignity as people is drawn from the formation of our conscience and obeying our conscience, that's God's will, writing his law on our hearts. And what a beautiful concept. In another paragraph, he talks about this freedom being a gift that has been given to us, this gift to obey, and it's the whole basis of our dignity of persons as created in God's image. And so obviously the conscience and religious freedom are critical concepts that we've been hearing about here. But as the Cardinal explained to us this morning, and actually I think what Veritatis Splendor talks a lot more about is, reining in our conscience, making sure our conscience is formed appropriately, and that conscience can err, and that what we cannot do is use our conscience as, an absolute value now. Well, because my conscience tells me this, that is now going to be the absolute morality that I can live by. And I think John Paul actually spends most of his time trying to disabuse us of that modern notion of conscience, and to help us talk about what does it mean to develop your conscience properly in relation to the teachings of the magisterium and forming our conscience. Otherwise, we all become a law to ourselves, and there is no such thing as absolute moral objective truth at all. Everybody has their own truth, which is kind of where we've maybe ended up today. But regardless of how you're pursuing your conscience, it's very clear that when it comes to the individual vis-a-vis the state is supposed to respect our conscience, how we are forming it. It's part of our religious freedom, and I suppose even if my conscience was ill-formed, the state should still respect that, even if God's going to slap me across the head later on and tell me that I was, mistaken and in error about that. And John Paul calls this, though, one of the positive achievements of our modern culture is this idea that we have recognized that religious freedom and the formation of our conscience is a foundation of the cumulative rights of the person, human rights, conscience, so the two are connected, and he sees that as a positive thing. And this, of course, builds on the Vatican II Declaration, which, as we heard again this morning, it's not about imposing, it's about proposing, right? So, yes, this is our conscience, yes, this is our freedom, and nobody should impose it upon us, especially not the state, but even the church shouldn't impose it. It should be something that we voluntarily, accept. And in his Redemptor Hominis encyclical, he points out that if you're in a society that curtails these rights and treats you like a second-class citizen, or somebody who is barely tolerated in the culture, that is really not an acceptable place to be. And I would argue that on some of these issues, especially the ones I'm about to talk about, that might be exactly where we feel like we are in some countries where we are operating, that we are barely being tolerated right now on some of these conscience issues based on our faith. And so the two issues that I want to kind of focus on, there's a lot of other conscience issues that are out there, but the two issues I want to focus on are ones that are perhaps, I had a hard time classifying these, but let's call these healthcare related issues. These are the ones actually that Professor Weiler was talking about this morning would be very problematic if you were to force a doctor or a nurse to do an abortion against their conscience. Or perhaps more recently, the idea of doing a gender-affirming surgery and being forced to either fund it or insure it or actually perform it. So I'll call those healthcare-related ones. We saw it in the United States a few years ago come up with the Obamacare Affordable Care Act issue, and various groups, both for-profit corporations like Hobby Lobby and nonprofits, religious organizations like the Little Sisters of the Poor, all saying, we believe this would violate our conscience. And then the other category I would just call, service-related. Maybe this is our employment, using our talents, our God-given gifts, whether it's making cakes or taking photographs or whatever it is that we do, to have to affirm things and support things that are morally objectionable to us. And so these are, to me, I think, two big issues that we're encountering, especially as non-discrimination, LGBTQ+, all those issues, abortion, are coming more in vogue due to the secularity that my good colleague here was just talking about is basically an unhealthy secularity that would result in this. So, all right. So I think we could agree, hopefully, especially in this audience, and even including Professor Weiler, that these are the kinds of conscience issues that John Paul II would say would be valid conscience issues, right? If you look at these, you look at the teachings of the church, if you have an issue with contraception or abortion or same-sex marriage, these are things that are based in the teachings of the church. This isn't just something I went off half-cocked and started forming on my own. So these are pretty sound conscience issues. Wow, good. So so let's talk about the two courts then, right? In America, we've got, or in the United States, we have the First Amendment that protects religion, but it doesn't give us any details about what that is. How do you protect religion? How do we protect that free exercise? And the court has not been particularly strong in this area, especially in the 1990s with the Smith case, applied a rational basis test, barely anything but rationality to laws that impacted our religion if they were neutral. The Europeans have Article 9 in the convention there, and that goes beyond religion. That's all freedom of conscience. But here, the Europeans at least gave us a test, but it's unfortunately essentially the same rational basis test that we see in the United States, and that is it necessary in a democratic society for public safety, morals, and all that good stuff to have to regulate something? So how does this play out? Essentially, because of that wide margin of appreciation, as the European Court talks about it, we have a situation where you have cases coming out of the European Court involving both abortion and issues like same-sex marriage and conscientious objection, where they're not coming out in favor of individual rights. These are either cases where the court just finds there's really not a religious right at stake at all, like in some of these abortion cases, people who are protesting inside an abortion clinic, or a vicar in Norway who decided he wasn't going to do his job anymore to oppose the Norway abortion law. The court, those weren't even admissible. The court didn't find that. And the Awida case involves either a public employee who didn't want to perform same-sex ceremonies, or a private contractor who didn't want to engage in psychosexual counseling for same-sex couples. And the court basically said, there's no consensus in Europe on this. It's not in the convention itself. So therefore, if a country says, as the UK said to those people, you're fired because you won't do that, then there's really no protection in the courts. And in the United States, it's not much better. We happen to have right now a balance of a conservative Supreme Court. So on these issues, we have some cases that are maybe a little more hopeful coming out of the Supreme Court on the Hobby Lobby cases I mentioned. There's also, of course, some cases involving conscience rights regarding same-sex couples. The Masterpiece Cake Shop case, of course, that baker, was, given a victory at the Supreme Court. Catholic Charities was given a victory at the Supreme Court when Philadelphia was going to, cancel their contract for foster care. But in both of those cases, the Supreme Court basically viewed these as targeting religion. So they didn't view it as neutral. So we don't really know what the court would do if they were given a truly neutral scenario where somebody was being forced to do something against their conscience. I suspect the current court would probably find a way to protect it. But where this leads me to is to say, we're talking about toward a century of persuasion, as John Paul would say it. I think our salvation is not going to come from the courts, whether it's in Europe, in Latin America, or in the United States. We are not going to be able to rely on judges to protect our conscience. We have to persuade our colleagues out there, the citizenry in our nations, that what they need to do is recognize these conscience rights is part of a healthy secularity, is something that needs to be respected and not in any way opposed. And we don't need to oppose it. We can respect the individual and also let society do what it needs to do in these other issues. So I will end on that and say thank you very much.